So one of the parts of our discussion that got truncated on Thursday's class was our discussion about the API project. I think that this is an important notion, so I thought I'd record something so that folks can review this later on when they need it for the SOAP Hello World service and for your future SOAP project. The reason that we have 3 projects here instead of just 2 is because we have some classes that we'd like to share in between the client and the server. Now, as you understand with SOAP, the client can't just be the web browser. And often it's not with REST anyway, but for the purposes of instruction, we've been using the web browser to test some of our REST clients, or our REST servers, and our REST client was the browser. In the case of SOAP, we don't have that kind of convenience, so we must have a separate client as our project. Because these classes are shared, we'd like to have some way to not duplicate them, to not just have to copy them between the 2 projects. And so Maven comes to the rescue here. What we do is we create another Maven project called API. And we say that the packaging is jar. What that means is that it becomes a library itself, and it becomes a dependency that is available for resolution in the client. So here what I've said is the same that appears in the web applications, but said that the packaging is jar. The result is that in both my client and my server, I can put the Hello WS API as a dependency using the group, artifact, and version number that I declared in the API's POM. This is kind of like an import statement for jars. And the jar up here contains these classes that both the client and the server need. So that's the primary motivation for an API project. Let's dig into it a little bit since we didn't have a lot of time on Thursday to talk about it. First, what are the dependencies that go in this project? Well, these are dependencies that you'd need no matter what for JAX-WS. But because they pertain particularly to the POJOs and to the interface, I've placed them here in the API project. The first one that you need is JAXB. JAXB is the library for annotating POJOs and telling Java how to turn them into XML. So if you want to translate Java POJOs into XML, you typically use JAXB, and this is the dependency that you'd use. The next one is the jar that makes the JSR 181, which is the name of the JSR for the SOAP annotations. It makes that JSR available to the deployment. By including this other jar, you're able to include the annotations that you need to supply to the interface that's shared between the client and the server. This one kind of has a funny name. Org Apache Geronimo specs for the group. Geronimo -ws -metadata _2.0 spec. Kind of strange, but that's the package that you need. And then once you do that, then you are able to, in your Hello World service, annotate it accordingly. Web service at the top to indicate to the SOAP server that this is what's called a port type, which we'll talk more about on Monday. But essentially it's SOAP's version of a class, a web method on each method that you want to expose to your SOAP through your SOAP layer, and web params to indicate the parameters that are used for your method. CXF will take all these parameters and turn them into a WSDL, and then that WSDL can be read by anybody in the world, including your SOAP client, in order to make the invocations. What's on the pojos are hints for how to turn it into XML. Here, you specify an XML root element. This is the root element that surrounds the representation of echo. And then here are the other XML elements. You can see that the names don't have to match, and that each one is just a regular pojo. It has a getter and setter. Now, one of the things that I have to do with JAXB that I personally do not like is that you need to choose one or the other here, and the other one you need to specify as that JAXB should ignore it. So you specify the XML element on the field, and then here on the message you say ignore. XML transient is the way that you tell it to ignore a particular property. It will look at this get message and try to turn it into a property, and then it will complain and say, wait, you have two message properties here. You need to tell me which one you want. And so you need to put this XML transient on top of the getter methods. Echoed is exactly the same. XML root element at the top. But here I've done something different just to illustrate some things that you can do with JAXB. Here I've told it that I want it to be an attribute instead of an element. An attribute is just a particular property on an element. That's why when you looked at the SOAP, let's see if it's still here. That's why when you looked at the SOAP response here, you see that it's an attribute instead of a sub-element. But here, they are sub-elements instead of attributes of arg0. So those are some things to keep in mind when building your API project, when you're building your pojos for the SOAP Hello World service, and when you're building the interface itself.